I want to introduce Stephen Warren. He was actually today in Des Moines. Today is Hawkeye Caucus Day, where representatives of the university, both students and faculty and staff, go to talk to our state legislators about the importance of support for the University of Iowa, as well as other Regents universities. So we're really pleased that he did this important work and sympathetic with how long a day he has had. But let me start out as we usually do by just asking you a couple of questions to get us started. Professor Warren is a colleague of mine in history, so these are pretend questions. But tell us a little bit about how you got interested in what it is you do, and particularly the issues of climate and environment we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. So I like to describe myself as an ethnographically informed historian, and so I started out doing what historians typically do, which is working in archives, kind of recovering Native histories. But basically, right after I defended my dissertation, I kind of had a bit of a crisis because, of course, most archives contain data written by colonizers, not by Native people themselves. And so the question remained, how am I possibly going to figure out indigenous perspectives on Native American history if the only place I ever visit is an archive full of documents written by colonizers? And so I started visiting Native people and sharing my history, the research that I had done with them. And from there, I was fortunate enough to be invited to ceremonies. And a lot of these ceremonies are private events. That is to say, you know, they're not advertised in newspapers or on Twitter or Facebook. You know, it's an invite-only kind of thing. And one of the things I began to notice is that virtually all of these ceremonies, in some way or another, center around food. And so that kind of led me to this odyssey into food sovereignty, which is a huge social movement among Native people today all across really the world. And I think it has big implications for humanity's relationship to the natural world and to biodiversity and sustainability. And so that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about today.
This is great. Okay, yeah. This is a really, you know, last week we had a very science-heavy lecture.
Oh, okay.
I'll save you from that.
Kind of introduction to many of the themes, and here we get a kind of a wonderful introduction to sort of social and cultural aspects of, again, climate and environment, particularly environment issues, relationships between humans and their environment.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited about this. I always ask our guests to let us know what kinds of courses you teach. So if students develop an interest in the kinds of things you're talking about, what else might they think about taking with you?
Yeah, and so actually, shameless promotion, this fall, the course that I'll be teaching is AINS, or actually we have a new name for American Indian Native Studies, and it's Native American Indigenous Studies. The course number will be 1290, and it's going to be called Native American Foods and Foodways. And so it's going to be basically an extension of this talk. And so, you know, if you're interested, I'd love it if you would check it out. It also is under D&I approval, so there you go.
You need the Gen Ed credit?
Yeah. And so, but I also teach Iowa history and surveys of American history. And so I'd love to see you if you're interested or you want to learn more. I'm happy to talk.
Okay, well, let me turn things over to you then. We will swap places if you like.
Okay, sounds good.
Take it on.
Okay. All right, so the Latin phrase at the top of the monitor there, which I'll save you from my own pronunciation of it, but if you look at it, I mean, it basically means when it comes to the matter of taste, there can be no dispute. And so what it means basically is that food and what we eat is an essential window into culture. In a way, it is the easiest way to sort of pick up on the identity of a person, right? I mean, if I were able to hang out with you all and kind of, you know, sample what you eat and have food with you, I could probably learn a lot about your identity, your relationship to other people, your relationship to food, what you value. And so for a lot of food writers, what we eat and how we eat it is really kind of the keystone of identity. And so I want to talk about that today, that basic principle, which I think is a kind of a basic human principle. But then I want to talk about why this idea of taste is really essential, why it's so critical to the world's 370 million indigenous people. And so, we'll talk about that idea. And of course, we have our own kind of expressions of it. I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg's gotten some negative press in the recently, well-deserved. But one of his big things, and he always makes an annual pledge, and so I don't know if you followed this, but in 2011 he made the pledge to eat only meat that died by his hands, right? So, if he was going to eat chicken or beef, he was going to slaughter it, right? And that was his 2011 pledge. And so he's kind of a manifestation of this locavore movement, which some of you might be interested in. If you've gone to a local farmer's market, or if you've, really, if you know something about maybe films such as Super Size Me or Corn Universe or King Corn, or if you've seen, films like Cowspiracy, you probably maybe are a little bit concerned about industrial agriculture. And so Zuckerberg's expression of that was, to eat local foods, only that which he grew. And he was really, or killed himself. And he was really kind of riffing off of another prominent food writer named Michael Pollan, who wrote this book called Omnivore's Dilemma. And, one of my favorite chapters in the book is about a feral pig hunt in Northern California. And so if you're really interested in some of the lengths to locavores have gone, you should check out Omnivore's Dilemma. He describes, essentially hunting for days and days and days for a feral pig. His goal is to make the perfect omnivore's meal, right? All locally sourced, right? And so he gathers mushrooms, and finally he shoots this pig and he hauls it back to Berkeley, California, and literally hauls it up to his condominium elevator in a body bag of sorts. I mean, and so people have sort of gone to sort of ridiculous lengths, to sort of achieve, this ultimate locally sourced consumption model that is now really common in this country at least, and in parts of the developed world for sure. And a lot of this seems ridiculous. I mean, I put these slides up here on purpose because when we sort of talk about it in these terms, it seems kind of an elite fantasy, right? This is something rich people do to sort of preoccupy themselves. But I want to turn quickly to indigenous manifestations of this phenomenon and sort of talk about how, there's something really deadly serious and important about indigenous relationships to foods that really marks it as different than what Zuckerberg and Pollan are up to. Let's see if I can, this way. Yeah, and so, since the so-called Green Revolution of the 1950s, Iowa City played a really critical role in this Green Revolution. We had a scientist here at the University of Iowa named Norman Borlaug, who, and Iowa City, promotes the World Food Prize. And it was Borlaug who really tried to come up with a way to sort of feed the world through the industrial production of food. And so Borlaug, first worked in Mexico, and then he worked in the Philippines, and finally in India, all places where there were high rates of starvation that periodically killed large numbers of people. And so what he wanted to do was he was a plant geneticist, and what he wanted to do was to figure out, essentially genetically modified crops that could withstand drought, that could feed the world, right? And so, Borlaug, won a Nobel Prize for his work, and he was really thought of as a savior of sorts in the developed world. And one of the things that's fascinating is that now that people have turned back toward the local food movement, and they're sort of tiring of these kind of industrial neoliberal models of food production, you know, Borlaug, he's become somewhat of a villain in some circles, particularly in places where food is a really, really important marker of identity. And so, for example, in India, there's been a real pushback against genetically modified foods. If you've heard about GMOs, then you know something about this. And so, industrial agriculture, is so common, right? In places like Iowa. I mean, something like 95% of the state of Iowa is under the plow, and of that 95%, probably 90% of it is corn and soybeans. Confined animal feeding operations produce nearly 50 million pigs a year that are slaughtered. Just in the state, Iowa produces more pigs for slaughter than its 3 closest state competitors combined. And so the scale of industrial agriculture is really quite incredible, and the environmental consequences of it, are obvious. And so one of the things that this has happened is it's wiped out. And industrial agriculture has really, devastated natural habitats. It's led to, enormous declines in the species that used to survive in the kind of microclimates that existed here in Iowa. And so over the last century, in the world, we've lost about 75% of the foods that used to be produced in these local microclimates by seeds that were passed down intergenerationally. And for indigenous people, in an era of climate change, one of the big threats that Native people face is biopiracy. And so plant geneticists have gone out all over the world searching for crops that can withstand drought, searching for crops that can withstand heat and flood, right? And they've gone to the world's indigenous people and started patenting seeds and medicines that fall under the rubric of traditional ecological knowledge, right? And so, the kind of great irony of industrial agriculture is that it's simultaneously destroying the natural world and the environments that Native American cultures sustained, while at the same time robbing indigenous people of the seeds that make up kind of the foundation of their culture. And so we're really at a crisis point, and I want to talk about that crisis for indigenous people. And so this goes back to Dr. Heinemann's question about sort of how I became interested in the subject of foodways. Most of the people who I work with were originally from the Midwest. And so I don't know how many of you know, but the United States experimented with ethnic cleansing as federal policy in the 19th century. The policy was called the Indian Removal Act, and it was enacted by President Andrew Jackson. And the goal of Indian removal was to literally rid the eastern half of North America of Native Americans. And so it was particularly devastating in the states of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. In those states today, there are no federally recognized tribes. So, for example, in Ohio, in 1795, there were 12 different tribes, right? And so in the space of 35 years, in one state alone, 12 states were forced out, right, by this country. And so most of my work deals with tribes whose original homeland is Ohio and Indiana. And so for me to work with these tribes, I have to go to Oklahoma. That's where they live now. And so think about that for a minute. think about the impact, you have for millennia, for thousands of years, your people have perfected a northern flint corn, one of the 2,000 varieties of corn grown in North America. You've perfected it so that it grows perfectly in the middle Ohio River Valley, that it's totally, adapted for that particular zone of frost-free days between maybe May 20th and October 1st, right? And now suddenly you're in Oklahoma, right? Is that corn going to grow there, right? Will it survive in the kind of in an area that receives far less rainfall, right? And so, we often talk about the tragedy of Indian removal in terms of what it did to to the people who died. So we talk about the human cost, right? The Trail of Tears for the Cherokees. 16,000 people start out on the journey, 4,000 people die along the way, right? In Indiana, the Potawatomi call their Trail of Tears the Trail of Death, right? And so it's totally devastating for humanity. But another way in which it's totally devastating for humanity in what it is what it did to food cultures, right? I mean, it just robbed Native people of a lot of the plants that were literally foundations to their ceremonies, right? To their identities as people. And so this is a painting, rather, of the Seneca Cayuga green corn ceremony. It's a gorgeous ceremony that I've attended many times. It's at this is the Bassett Grove Stomp Ground. It's an area of northeastern Oklahoma. And what you're looking at is a longhouse. And what I love about the Seneca Cayuga green corn is that, there's a lot of people there just hanging out, right? There's a lot of people who think of it as kind of a family reunion. They're visiting with relatives, they're walking outside of the longhouse casually, but underneath the roof of the longhouse is this ceremony that's been going on for millennia, right? And so what happens in the green corn is every August, people bring in all of the crops that they've grown on their family plots, right? So they bring in watermelons and squash and corn, right, and beans. They bring in all these different crops and from their individual gardens, and they place it at the very center of the longhouse on this giant cheesecloth. And the clan mothers, accept it. It's a matrilineal society, and so women are totally in charge of this event. And then so everybody, it's just this enormous. It's the biggest pile of food you've ever seen, in this longhouse. And then they cover it in cheesecloth, and they dance and they pray over it for about 5 hours. And then the clan mothers unfold the cheesecloth, and they redistribute the food to everyone who's in attendance, right? And so it's this deeply symbolic ritual about being Seneca Cayuga, right? These are our plants, right? These are our people. And there's this connection between plants and people that literally affirms tribal identity, right? I mean, if you take watermelon or squash out of the green corn, you're kind of one of us now, right? And so it's hugely significant. But as I watched it from start to finish one year, I became really troubled because I noticed that, in fact, almost all of the crops brought in had been purchased, mainly at Walmart. And I began to see that this is a real problem with identity, right? Because if you think about religion, most religions have in some way a kind of a material dimension to it, right? I mean, there's a kind of an economic aspect to it, a rationale for existence. And so in this way, the green corn ceremony, one part of being Seneca Cayuga, right, is growing corn, right, for your people. that kind of obligation, or the ethos of having a garden, not simply to feed yourself, right, but to maybe feed other people, to share in it, to affirm tribal identity. And so what happens, right, to a tribe's identity if they're totally disconnected from the crops they've grown, right? I mean, you know, the ceremony itself sort of explains all kinds of things. It explains the relationship between women and men. You know, it explains the origin of their people. You know, when Corn Mother gifted corn to the people. And so if you're not actively involved in planting, you know, you're disconnecting yourself from the origin stories of the Seneca-Cayuga people. And so luckily for me, you know, I have limited time, so I'll stop in the digression. But luckily for me, as I was watching this, there were a whole group of people, real activists in the tribe who were as alarmed as I was about it, and who began to think no longer have And so this is the beginning of what I like to call a food sovereignty movement. And this is a social movement that I'm going to talk about. It's a global movement, but it's unique and particular to each tribe that expresses it based on their own relationship to food. And so one of the reasons why it's so hard for, why Native people have lost control of their foodways is in part biopiracy, but there's an earlier story to that I think is really significant, and that is that, you know, fundamentally the issue is about land. And if there are two characteristics of American colonization, it is that colonizers to this country stole indigenous land on the one hand and stole African labor on the other, right? And so the theft of land and the theft of labor make the wealth that really drive this country's development. And so, just to cite one example, for 3 years I worked on a big grant for the Eastern Shawnee tribe, and I was shocked to find out that in 1832, when the Eastern Shawnees were forcibly removed to, if I could click, see if I can find it. So the Eastern Shawnees were clicked to this tiny little corner of northeastern Oklahoma. They got 64,000 acres of land in 1832. And would you guess how much they had in 1970? Who wants to take a shot? They started out with 64,000 acres of land in 1832, and how much did they have in 1970? Take a wild guess.
6,000.
6,000? Oh, way too generous. Way too generous. Yeah, they wound up with 59 acres in 1970. And so, you know, the story here, right, is that Native American foodways are destroyed by the seizure of native land, right? I mean, you could plant these crops if you actually had a place to grow them, but the reality is that Native people become basically landless in this area of the world by 1900. And so now, Native people are really concerned, right? How do I get my land back? How do I get my seeds back, right? I want to reverse or halt this process. And so, remember I talked a little bit about the Midwest and Indian removal. So this is the only tribe in northeastern Oklahoma that's actually indigenous to Oklahoma, the Quapaw. The remainder, the Peoria from Illinois, obviously, the Ottawa, Michigan, and Ohio, the Shawnee, Ohio, the Modoc, California, they arrived in railroad cars after a genocidal war was fought against them in chains. The Wyandotte, also from Ohio, and the Seneca, this particular group, also from Ohio. And so, that's where I go to do my own work. So the sort of origins of the food sovereignty movement are actually not in North America, but in India. And it begins in the 1980s. And Vandana Shiva is one of the heroines of the story. Vandana Shiva actually came to this campus in 2016. And she has basically made the argument that controlling seeds is really the essence of food sovereignty, and it's the main way that indigenous people the world over can fight back against basically big agriculture and the kind of Borlaugian industrial agriculture I talked about previously. And so one of the things that Shiva has fought against is BT eggplant and BT cotton. And so in India, eggplant of all plants became, kind of a lightning rod for food sovereignty, because essentially Western corporations were trying to kind of sell Indians on the production of the kind of eggplant you get in the stores, the big fat kind of glommy things. I grow them in my own garden, but and they're good. But in India, they have, dozens of eggplant varieties that are very particular to regional dishes. And so the idea of kind of homogenizing food, and just to think about what that would do to India, right? I mean, about 25% of India's population is tribal or indigenous. Linguistically diverse places in the world. If you've ever traveled there, you know that there's a huge difference between northern India not just Indian identity, right, but the India as a whole. And to this process. And she's taken her message globally. So she goes to conferences all over the world where she inspires indigenous people to kind of fight back against the kind of homogenization of food. And just in case you need kind of an illustration of the scale of the problem, today globally, there are 12 table crops that make all of the calories humans consume. And only 3 crops make up 60% of the total. So, wheat. And so the issue that we face in terms of climate change is what happens when the 3 species developed in labs by corporations can no longer be grown in vast areas of the world that are changing in response to the climate. Right? I mean, it's really a global crisis. If the banana crop, the global banana crop, developed a blight, right, we would suddenly find ourselves without that crop, right? Because we have basically settled on one kind of banana that we all have to eat, right? And so a lot of these food sovereignty activists are kind of making a case, look, you might think we're bad guys here. We're not really. We're not only making an argument in defense of our culture, but we're making an argument about food security, right? Because if we don't have crops that are unique to particular places, we're not going to make it, right? And so Shiva has inspired indigenous people to really take control of their seeds. And so here in Iowa, there's one federally recognized tribe in the state of Iowa. It's the Meskwaki, and they're about an hour and a half from here. And they have a food sovereignty program, and this is their flint corn. Here's a couple of pictures of what it should look like. And this is what it shouldn't look like. So what do you notice about it? The one that's kind of wrong. Okay, it's smaller. Yeah, absolutely. What about the kernels? Yeah, yeah. So these are over here. These are the good guys, right? These are or gals, depending upon your take. But this is the problem for indigenous people, because remember I said that about 90% of Iowa is in corn and soybeans, and corn happens to be one of the more promiscuous plants on the planet Earth. You know, it's wind germinated, wind pollinated, and so basically what happens is the Meskwaki plant their very particular corn, one of the 2,000 varieties that was created for the unique climate of Iowa by indigenous farmers. They plant it, everything's cool, but then the tasseling time happens, right? And all those neighbors, right? All surrounding Tama, if you've ever been on the Lincoln Highway, you know what I'm talking about, right? All that corn, right? It starts floating in the air, right? And so Native people have come to describe non-native corn as invader corn, because it really is kind of like colonization, right? They can't even sustain their own corn crop because it's being germinated by by non-native corn, right? So it's really, there are real obstacles, right? Even in the Meskwaki case, where they do have land to plant their corn, how do you protect it from being cross-pollinated by invader corn that is going to go mainly into feeding animals in confined animal feeding operations, right? So it's a real crisis because, as Jerry Youngbear points out, it's essential to their tradition. I mean, this is the corn that they eat at all of their ceremonies, right? And they should have a right to eat corn that hasn't been kind of tainted, right, by non-native products. Another big lightning rod issue has revolved around quinoa. And so I don't know if any of you have eat quinoa, if you're into it. If you do, it's thought of as a super grain, right? And it's amazing because it's incredibly drought resistant. It doesn't require very much water. And so it is being thought of as sort of the future of food. That in a changing climate, quinoa could be sort of the answer to the shortages in the global food supply, right? Because it's a tough plant. It can grow almost anywhere. And so two plant geneticists from Colorado State University went down to Bolivia and started hanging out with Quechua and Aymara quinoa growers. And the growers didn't really know sort of what their motives were. It was kind of indefinite. And these plant geneticists brought back some seeds to Colorado State. And would you believe what they did? They actually patented the quinoa seed. And once a seed is patented, the indigenous people have lost control of it. They can only get access to the seed from the people who hold the patent. And so essentially, they had been robbed. This is a great example of biopiracy. Fortunately, for the Quechua and Aymara people in Anapqui, they have an activist president who, to my knowledge, is the only indigenous president in the world, Bolivia's Evo Morales. And Evo Morales went before the United Nations. He complained to Colorado State University. He really took it to him. And in a remarkable turn of events, Colorado State University forced the plant geneticists to drop their patent and return it to the Quechua people. And so they were able to save their seeds. But unfortunately, there have been other instances of biopiracy of quinoa, and so now it's being grown in Pakistan, It's being grown in a lot of mountainous regions all over the world by people who have gone on similar adventures stealing their product. And so I say this to you because, you know, many of you are going to want to eat this, right? And one of the really cool things that you can do, if you care, is you can be particular about buying products by indigenous growers, okay? Because about 60% of all the vegetables that were grown in the world in 1492 were originally cultivated by indigenous people. And so one of the ways you can respect and honor and promote an Apqui is by buying their quinoa rather, and not invader quinoa. And so a big advocate for an Apqui was Mamami, Louis Oscar Mamami, and you know, he was just incensed by the theft of this traditional knowledge. You know, quinoa is the mother grain of his people. And so, you know, he made the argument that, you know, our seeds were not invented by researchers in North America, right? It was Andean farmers who figured out, right, how to make this area grow. Another big case of biopiracy is wild rice. And so it's much closer to home. So here in the United States, particularly in Minnesota, you know, the Anishinaabe word for wild rice is manomen. And manomen is really critical to Anishinaabe or Ojibwe identity. You know, in their origin story, they were basically told that as you migrate across North America, you need to settle at the place where food grows on the water, right? And so when they land in Minnesota and they see wild rice, they've arrived. But what happened is, incredibly, researchers in their home state at the University of Minnesota took their wild rice seeds, patented it, and now most wild rice that we consume every day is actually grown in California in and around Sacramento, in a place where wild rice is just not sustainable, right? We all know that California has this huge water crisis, right? So it has no place being there. And so the Anishinaabe have taken to describing this wild rice that most of us eat as tame rice, right? And so if you're given the choice between tame rice and wild rice, choose wild rice, okay? Eat the real thing, not the genetically modified plant grown in California. And there's actually a great organization that you can Google if you're interested in buying real wild rice and getting recipes like it. It's called the White Earth Land Recovery Project. And it was an organization established by a former presidential candidate and Harvard economist and cultural warrior, Winona LaDuke. You know, if you ever want to read about a really inspiring Native woman, you know, just check out LaDuke's story. She's a really incredible person. And so, let's see. I'm trying to figure out what time it is, but this thing says it's fast. So it's about, oh.
About 6:20.
Okay, I'm rushing. So for the remainder of my talk, I want to talk about Arizona and Mexico. I want to shift gears a little bit because, you know, I'm trying to basically give you a survey of food sovereignty movements across North America, and it's kind of hard, right? Because tribes that were originally from the Midwest face the problem of land loss. Some tribes all over the world face the problem of biopiracy. But in the desert Southwest, their biggest problem or challenge isn't land loss, but the theft of water. And so in the Sonoran Desert, This would be, the area from basically Phoenix, Arizona, to Tucson and really on into Mexico. There are two population of O'odham people. They used to be called the Pima and Papago, but their name for themselves is the Acamel and Tohono O'odham. And they're remarkable agriculturalists because they figured out how to make the desert bloom. And so the Acamel O'odham were the inheritors of the Hohokam pre-contact culture. One of the things that they did, this is in the Phoenix area, is they developed a series of canal systems that fed off of the Gila River and that made it possible to grow corn, squash, beans, various melons, in places where, in the summer it can get to be 115 degrees and where the annual rainfall rates are below 9 inches per year, which you'd think would be sort of impossible, right? And so they created canal systems, and one of my favorite naturalists, Orea, studied these canals, and one of the things that they found is that desert farmers, by farming, literally made the desert bloom and supported the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of species that would not have otherwise lived in the desert. And so, the Sonoran Desert is an incredibly forbidding place. And if you've ever been there, I lived there for 2 years, and one of the things that's remarkable about it is that it's today the land of interstates. You sort of get lost on highways and byways, and everyone's driving 70 miles an hour across, a massive, sprawling suburban, kind of hellhole, really. The smog is so thick that you could walk on it when you wake up in the morning. I remember when I first arrived there, I got out of the car at about 9 o'clock at night and put my foot down on the pavement, and it squished. It was still kind of porous and squishy from heat. That's how hot it gets, and so. These desert farmers created a canal system that supported fish species that couldn't have possibly lived in the Sonoran Desert. So there was a kind of a suckerfish and a catfish that somehow lived there. Because there was water in the canals, there were bird species that arrived there. Because they planted, seeds of various varieties, they could go rabbit hunting in their fields, right, and get game. And so, the point of all this is to suggest that when Native Americans were here and they were actually cultivating the land, the earth looked very different, right? They made a very, very different impact on the land itself. And so biodiversity is really critical to the restoration of these old farming practices, and so basically in 1870, Americans started coming into the Sonoran Desert, and what happened is they began diverting water from the Gila River to support their own farms, and within 20 years, this incredible, abundant place was dry and desolate, and Native people found themselves eating commodity foods, white flour, packaged beef, fry bread became kind of, a common food that people ate, and suddenly the health impacts for Native people became really tragic. So today, among the Atham people and Native people more generally, there's a kind of a common joke, in Gallows humor sort of way, is that Native Americans are first in everything you want to be last in. And so Native people have diabetes in the United States. They have the highest rates of hypertension. They have the lowest life expectancy of any population in the United States. And it's all related to stories like this, to the robbery of Atham water, and to their dependence now on colonizers' food. And so before colonizers screwed it all up, the Atham people had this incredible system of desert agriculture, hunting, and foraging that was all interrelated. And so, for example, when the saguaro cactuses bloom in February and March, they gather the buds from the saguaro. They make a wine out of it. They consume the wine. They play a game. And then it's thought that the saguaro fruit and consuming the wine from the saguaro fruit actually prompts rain. And then they use, in the southern Sonora Desert, among the Tohono O'odham, they use alluvial fan agriculture, basically where you divert flood water into your fields. You sort of inundate your fields with torrential rain as a result of the dance that they conduct with saguaro wine. And the desert blooms. And so today they call that the rain ceremony, or Nahuatl. And they literally believe that conducting the rain ceremony is a way of, in their way, you can't have rain in the Sonoran Desert. You can't have agriculture unless you do this. And so, it's, as you can see, one of the things that I find really beautiful about Native American foodways is that every food they eat is intimately connected to a ceremony. You can't have the food without the ceremony. And so there's a lot of, it's a very kind of, eating is a very sacred experience. And there's a way of, there's a sort of a prayerful attitude toward the consumption of food that I think we would all do well to learn from. And so, when they pray during the rain ceremony, they will literally pray that my old women may eat of it and lengthen their days, right? And so it's a prayer for the crops, but also a prayer for the people. Oops. And so this is the area that the Atham now occupy. And as you can see, it's dramatically reduced from what it once was. And they have been basically separated from their foodways by colonizers. And one of the great things about the Atham story is that they founded a food sovereignty movement called Tohono O'odham Community Action, or TOCA. And you can Google TOCA, and you can buy a cookbook, and you can buy seeds through an allied organization called Native Seeds/Search, which has been working with plant geneticists to recover indigenous seeds that have been lost. And so one of the people who I admire, who happens to be a family relative. He comes to Iowa City a lot. His name is Gary Paul Nabhan. And Gary Paul is a botanist. And one of the things that he's been doing is going back to archaeology, right? And finding the genetic code of these old seeds and bringing them back to life, right? And now, if you were to go to the Sonoran Desert, there are areas where native Atham people are actually growing the old crops again. And their motivations for doing it aren't really to encourage biodiversity. I think the main reason for native people today is because of the terrible health effects that have come with eating Western food. And so, you know, the tragedy of it is that colonizers really thought that they knew what was best for indigenous people, and so they told them to give up what they were planting. And, you know, they followed their advice. And so, you know, there are areas where these desert adapted crops are being grown now, and we're getting back to kind of the ancient wonder that we once had in the Sonoran Desert. And, you know, again, I shared with you that I'm an archivist and that I go to historical archives and I do research. And, you know, one of the things that you see in the colonial documents is just the sense of wonder that colonizers had about indigenous foodways when they first arrived. You know, they were really amazed. And so the Spanish colonizer, Juan Bautista de Anza, described fields of wheat so large that standing in the middle of them, one cannot see the ends, right? So this is what Native people were able to do when they were in charge of their own agriculture. And I think if there's a moral to the story, I think we need to basically allow these local food cultures to be restored, right? To really trust indigenous people to be in charge of their foodways. And so Toka farm manager Nolan Johnson explains that you know, the plant can handle the heat and go for long periods of time without water if you treat them like a person. Johnson trusts in his elders. He taught him that if you want a good crop, talk to your plants. Sing to your plants, and they'll reward you. Ask them to bless you with a good harvest. You know, this idea of the personification of plants, you know, that's so fundamentally different from the way that non-native people think about plants and animals. You know, one of the things that I love about indigenous philosophies is that they basically believe that all living beings have thought, that they're sentient, that they have souls, right? And so for them, their relationship to food is about respect and reciprocity, right? In order to get a good crop, you owe something to that crop, right? You treat them like a person. Like if we were able to adopt these kinds of philosophies, that the world would be a much better place, right? So I'd like to stop there and give you some time to ask me questions. If you have them, I'd love to talk more, and I thank you for your time. Yeah. Water.
So let me invite questions, if anyone would like.
So I kind of understood what you meant with the biopiracy, but how do the biopirates prevent the people who are originally growing the plant from saving part of their crop for seed and continuing to just grow it on their own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it really depends on the scale of it. Basically, all the world over, we used to save seeds, right? And so you set aside, you know, about 10% of your crop. You know, you save the best seeds, you let them dry, right? And the next season, you plant them. And seed saving is basically accepted if you aren't going to participate in the marketplace, okay? So if all you want to do is eat it yourself. You know, a corporation isn't going to come and say, no, you know, give me back my seeds, right? But if you want to sell it at a farmer's market, or if you want to get, you know, put it out on the internet or something like that, then you will take some heat. So there was a big case that Monsanto won several years ago in Indiana about corn, where a Hoosier farmer, you know, he saved his seeds, you know, and that was what he did. He grew corn, right? The seeds originated from Monsanto, and Monsanto said, no, you must buy the seeds from me every single year you plant. And so, you know, essentially, that's the story for the vast majority of the farmers in the world, right? That if they want to farm, you know, they have to first purchase, you know, the seed from the corporation that owns the patent. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to farm today, you know, because there are just so many costs associated with it. You know, and so that's kind of the answer to the question. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Yeah.
Hold on a second, let me just bring you the mic.
I have a couple questions, but
Sure.
to sort of add on to the previous question, wouldn't so are you saying in essence that because my initial thought was that the Monsanto and other companies that copyright their genetically modified like crops and other organisms would have to have their own like genetically modifications in order to have a copyright, but it seems to me that you're saying that the Monsanto and other companies are just modifying the plants themselves, which seems kind of, it doesn't seem right to me, because how could they do that if it wasn't, if they didn't make any changes? How you can copyright something if you haven't made anything original yourself? So what, in essence, like how can, are they copyrighting the plant itself? And if not, which, because I don't think that's what they're doing, if not, then why can't the indigenous people just plant the original crop?
Right. Well, there are a couple of answers to that. I think you're basically correct, right? That they've modified it. You know, they can go back to the original. But one of the issues that the Anishinaabe people face is now they have this tame rice that's grown in California, right? And it's copyrighted, it's genetically modified rice. You know, it's not really what grows in Minnesota, but it's marketed as wild rice. And so I think the issue for indigenous people or for quinoa growers is, okay, yeah, you know, maybe we can have control of our older seed, but by patenting it and mass producing it, you've essentially denied us access to the market. It's a little bit, I'm trying to think of how to explain this in a way that makes sense. One of the problems that indigenous people face is production and access to markets, right? It takes an enormous amount of money to gather wild rice, you know, to process it, to thresh it, and then to reach markets, right? And so, you know, what's really devastating Native people is that corporations are much better at developing economies of scale and mass producing crops that mimic Native crops, right? And they can do it more cheaply than indigenous people can. And it's one of the reasons why Evo Morales in Bolivia is so upset, right? Because if the crop is grown and mass produced in, say, Pakistan by a big corporation, right, and sold the world over, it will mean that indigenous growers will be consigned to poverty, right? Because their version of quinoa won't ever reach people like you and me, right? We just won't have access to the original crop. And so I think you're basically right? That the GMO patent doesn't preclude, you know, the native seed from continuing, But can an indigenous food survive today if it isn't connected to a market? Right? I mean, I think my argument would be that we all need to support indigenous foods by actually buying the real thing, not the genetically modified thing. And so that's kind of my take on it. Does that make sense?
Yes. My next question was, you said earlier that the colonizers' food is the root problem causing many of the health issues
Right.
of like being first and the things that you want to be last in.
That's right.
But if that's true, then why aren't the rest of us who eat basically the same food facing the same level of difficulty?
Well, we are. I mean, obesity rates in the United States are higher than they've ever been. But if you've studied type 2 diabetes and the rise of it, or hypertension, you know that it tends to affect people who live in food deserts, right? People who buy prepackaged foods that have very low nutritional value in places like Come and Go or Quick Stop, right? And in reservation communities, that's often the only place you can get food, right? Also, in some urban areas, in some cities, there are vast stretches where you just can't find a grocery store, right, that'll sell green vegetables, right? And so there's that issue. But another issue that geneticists found is that human beings all over the world co-evolved with the plants that they grew. And so the argument that they're making is that, you know, Native people can eat they can eat granulated sugar just like you and I can, but it's only been, you know, 3 generations where people have actually eaten that food after 12,000 years of eating a whole nother kind of food. And so the argument is that wheat in particular and sugar are the huge culprits, in part because most Native people just didn't evolve with those plants. You know, a German who drinks tons of beer is going to be okay with barley, right? Because, you know, for millennia, that's what they did. It's a different story with people who just aren't accustomed to processing that food.
You cited packaging earlier. Would you say that it's packaging and food preservation is as much of the issue, or is it genetically modified organisms?
I mean, I think the basic issue is that we don't eat enough fresh food, you know, and so if you go back to the slide by Michael Pollan, you know, the essential principle that all locavores, you know, make is that, you know, we would be a lot better off if we just ate real food, right? So the JERF acronym, you know, just eat real food. You know, if you're eating prepackaged food, right, it's a synthetic product created in a factory. You know, it has all kinds of additives and maybe cancer-causing agents, you know, placed to it. And so the goal is to just reconnect people to fresh food. And indigenous people developed foodways that were intensely seasonal. And so, you know, they had a seasonal round that meant that they were always consuming whatever was fresh, right? Whether that was maple sugar in February and early March, or, you know, meat in November and December, or corn in August, right? If you think about you know, what they had to do to get enough food to eat, it was about always finding, gathering, and harvesting or hunting a fresh product. And that's what we've gotten away from. And the argument is that our health has declined because of that.
Okay, and this will be my final question. I guess I'll split this question into like 2 bits. So do you think that genetically modified organisms are the problem? And if they are the problem, then, or like, how can we justify not using genetically modified organisms when, like, I remember recently not so long ago in Libya and in Egypt, many of the protests that occurred down there was because, we like to imagine it was because of freedom and corruption of the government, but the biggest reason of all was food. One of the big cries during the protests was the lack of bread. but the lack of bread was caused by the droughts caused in Kansas. How can we justify not using genetically modified organisms when food concerns are rising, and like we need to create food that can resist drought so that concerns don't like that don't happen in the future?
I think that you've asked a great question, and I think that your devil's advocate position is the right one. I think this is the question of our age. But I would turn it back to you, right? I mean, in the same way that we can't survive without genetically modified organisms because there are, what, 7 billion people on the planet now? Right? I mean, that's your basic point. So too, we're going to reach a point where we can't survive, because we simply have one of the least diverse strains of plants and vegetables like ever in the history of humanity, and we live in a monoculture, and I think that there will be a consequence to that, because at some point there will be a blight that will destroy wheat or bananas or one of these genetically modified crops, and there won't be a substitute. And so the point that advocates of biodiversity make is that flora and fauna prosper when we grow a more sophisticated round of crops. But we prosper too, because our culture is better. You eat less meat. If you're growing crops that are related to a microclimate, and so that's their basic argument. But I get your point, and I really I'm not trying to make a cop out, but I do think that industrial agriculture has really terrible consequences for people's health and for the health of the natural world. And I think we'd be better off with a more sophisticated menu of crops than the 3 that we currently depend on to survive.
Thank you. Very interesting set of questions. We've got another one over here.
So my question is, you talked about local, environments, biodiversity that's supported by areas, and the people have a connection to a lot of the various plants and things that grew naturally in those locations. What are some of the plants that were grown here in the Midwest, in Iowa, that weren't just corn? Obviously, corn does very well here, but I know that there are other plants and things that grew here natively that do very well. There's some fruits now that are being grown in parts of Iowa that are a big seller that are native to Iowa and are doing very well. And also, as a side note, how does that play out for farmers who are looking obviously for a dollar? They're trying to make money. How to do biodiverse crops, make it to market, make it profitable?
Yeah. One of the points that I probably should have been better at making, Peter, and I really appreciate your question, is that it's not so much that there was a much bigger variety of crops. So like I think it isn't acai berries, but it's elderberries, I think it is, that you're referring to.
That's one of the names of the
or pawpaws, or so there were crops or foraging possibilities here in Iowa that no longer exist. But the main point, right, is that corn, beans, and squash, were on the menu wherever you were in the Midwest, particularly in Iowa. But there was just a greater variety of subspecies within each category, right? And so the thing that's happened over the last 150 years is we just grow fewer commodities and fewer kinds of commodities, right? And so in 1900, a typical Iowa farm would have about 8 farm commodities. Now we're lucky to have 2, right? And most farmers specialize in either livestock or one commodity, but not both, right? It's very rare to find a farm that has both animals and plants, in production. And so, it's just the varieties, right? And the diversity of plants and animals that used to occur, on any given farm. that have been replaced by, again, corn and soybeans in one distinct variety sold by one corporation to almost everyone in an area. And so in my own back garden, I grow a squash that I really love called a cushaw. There are a lot of Native people who argue that the cushaw is a Midwestern variety of squash. I love it. It gets to about 25 pounds, and when it's finally ready, I carry it around like a little baby. I'm very proud of it. So there are these kinds of squash varieties that are really cool. Acorn squash, butternut squash varieties that, indigenous varieties of that. Beans. There's a Trail of Tears bean, that's really cool that the Cherokees brought with them. And if you're into it, here in Iowa, Seed Savers is really the place to go for these old varieties. They operate as kind of a seed bank, and one of their arguments, Seed Savers is in Decorah, Iowa, and one of their basic argument is, look, if you want to save these cultures, then plant the seeds. The seeds have to be grown, and so the second question about markets is really critical, and what's neat about the Anapqui in Bolivia is that it's a partnership between a French company and Bolivian quinoa growers to help them create kind of regular systems of production and reduce shipping costs and find customers via the internet, right? That would be impossible, for people living on the Bolivian Altiplano, right? And so, these kinds of partnerships are ones that are pretty successful. There's just also there's another part of it too. In South Africa, the San people, S-A-N, we used to call them Bushmen, and now we've gotten a little bit more progressive and no longer call them that. But anyway, they had they knew of a desert cactus that was an appetite suppressant that they would eat before going on a hunt in the Kalahari Desert. Okay, and the South African government worked with a corporation and stole the knowledge, and now markets this appetite suppressant for people like you and me who want to cut some down. And that's not cool. And so one of the things that the San did is they fought back and they went before the United Nations, and now that corporation and the South African government gives them a percentage of the money they make off the sale of that product derived from the cactus. And so it's these kinds of models that have to happen because, again, the main point about all this is that when we deprive indigenous people of markets, when we take their knowledge, right, we're profiting from their cultural copyright, right? And so I like the San model because, they're not in charge of the production of the appetite suppressant, but it originated with them, so they honor that by giving them a percentage. These are the kinds of things we need to do to really honor indigenous knowledge.
Other questions over on this side? Pardon me.
So I just wanted to know, what role does capitalism play in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Capitalism plays a huge role in it, and so, I think that what should happen, right, is and the internet has actually helped a lot with this, and we have an expert here on campus named Brandy Jansen in anthropology who has written about local foodways and how to connect farmers to markets, and so she's more of an expert than I am. But the global reality is that in order for these particular seeds and these particular cultures to survive, we have to start buying direct from indigenous people who are participating in the market, right? And we just have to be better consumers, right? Also, indigenous people have to work harder, through the internet, through the courts, you know, to develop enough product so that we can consume it. And I think that's really the hope for indigenous foodways, you know, is that capitalism, capital markets, you know, might actually hold out, you know, the hope of our, you know, of buying these crops. And so check out the White Earth Land Recovery Project if you're interested in kind of the various models. Anapqui is another model. But yeah, it's a really difficult problem. So thanks for the question.
I actually would love to ask a follow-up
Sure.
question myself, because it sounds like part of what's going on here, actually, this might be a common thread among many of these questions, the question about why indigenous people can simply hold on to they can keep planting their own seeds just because some big company then starts marketing them.
Right.
But it sounds like part of what you're talking about is a larger economic shift that was sort of happened at the same time, you know, maybe over the course of a couple centuries. That is, that in some of these communities, once upon a time, simply self-sustaining agriculture would have been enough.
Right. Right.
Whereas now, even if you can keep planting your own seeds, in the current world, you can't even maintain your own community without actually having access to external markets. Right. So in some senses, the notion of just, yeah, you can keep the seeds, keep planting them, is kind of trying to turn the clock back a bit to something, and maybe no longer possible because you can't do on 59 acres what you might once have done on, you know, 65,000 acres, right? You can't do sustenance agriculture. Is that, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of this whole thread that we've heard among a lot of people here, right? Which is, well, just because somebody goes and copyrights your seed, can't you keep growing it anyway? Is that the question with capitalism? I'm wondering if we can bring those together.
Yeah, and actually, if I can return to your question, which is sort of difficult, you know, I focused a lot on agriculture. But another big part of indigenous food systems is hunting, is fishing, and so in 1974, tribes from the Northwest Coast, Washington State and Oregon, won a Supreme Court decision called the Bolt decision, B-O-L-D-T, and it gave them the right to hunt and gather and to fish salmon on all of the territory that they ceded to colonizers. And so, you know, their Aboriginal homeland before their footprint was so drastically reduced, it gave them the right to fish and hunt there. And so, you know, one of the arguments, you know, that people in the Northwest Coast make is that, you know, the survival of these species depends upon the human appreciation of them, right? That by gathering them, you know, you're going to do the things necessary to ensure that they exist. You know, so seagull eggs, for example, are a delicacy. Salmon fishing, right? A big flashpoint is in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan. They also won a Supreme Court case that allowed them to fish and hunt on their Aboriginal territory. And I don't know if you followed it, but there's been what has been called a walleye war in Wisconsin over indigenous people fishing out of season. You know, when white folks can't fish, right? They're out there doing the deal. But they have their own Great Lakes Indigenous Fish and Wildlife Commission that has bag limits, that has quotas for how much you can take. In other words, it's a sustainable gathering, hunting, fishing system that is administered by indigenous people, and this has driven non-native people crazy. So it's not always about access to markets, in other words. I mean, capitalism is big, and I think with wild rice and quinoa, damn, hell yeah, you know, we should buy the stuff that's, you know, that's wild, you know, it's from indigenous people. But hunting and fishing, that's more about sustainability. I don't know if you followed this, but recently there was a whale hunt in Washington State by the macaw, and this drove people crazy, right? How could you possibly hunt whales, right? They're depopulated by humans, but their point was we didn't do it, right? It's not our responsibility, and hunting whales is essential to our identity. So they weren't doing it so they could sell whale meat, on a market. They were doing it because it was essential to their identity.
Just one last thing.
Sure.
So I read something online, and it said that if you're gonna eat a plant or something like that,
Yeah.
eat a plant that has like seeds in it or something, and you're more safe for it being organic or whatever.
Yeah.
And then now I'm hearing that if it does have seeds in it, it doesn't need to be like genetically modified and stuff like that. So what I'm going at is I guess like you were swaying from the point of it being more I think capitalistic venture to it being more of ethical, I guess, because I was also trying to figure out how it also applied to people who are also not native, and vice versa. And so I was thinking like, so what exactly like scares you about this issue, or what is the main concern for the future? Like if there is a future, and if it can be reversed in this, or is it just following a specific trend into something you might not like?
Well, I have too many concerns to name. But my wife is a professor of religious studies here, and she spent a week in a meat packing plant in Tama, Iowa. She came home from the week, and she told me about how the cattle were slaughtered, and taking an air gun and then driving a metal spike into their skull and making sure that their heart continues to beat after they're brain dead, so that all the blood drains out of their body. And she described the process to me, and so I was talking to a colleague today, and I eat meat, but I think mass-produced meat and mass slaughter and the kind of inhumanity of the way in which we treat animals in particular, the fact that the pigs we eat, for example, if you eat pork, it takes about 6 months to fatten a pig today before it's slaughtered. And so there are basically 2 big waves of pigs that are grown in the state. And in an individual meatpacking plant here in Iowa, they slaughter about 14,000 pigs a day. I mean, think about the scale of that. And so how you treat the animal, right? Is pretty violent, right? How you treat the earth if you're raising animals that way is pretty violent. So then, we have 10,000 confined animal feeding operations at least in the state, and an individual pig produces about 8 pounds of manure a day. So what do we do with that waste? We spread it on fields, and then it becomes airborne, and we inhale it when the wind blows. And so, not only are we degrading the animal, but we're degrading our own health. And it's great to eat meat every day, but it's probably not very good for us in the long term, particularly when you consider that about 75% of the antibiotics we produce in the United States goes to animals, just to keep them alive in these conditions. So that's just one piece of it, right? Like, that kind of traumatizes me a lot, So I don't want to go on and get apocalyptic. Lisa and I have a joke about trying not to be too apocalyptic with each other.
Are there additional questions? Yes, here.
So there might be, I was just thinking about people, non-native people, who might want to grow some of these native-grown seeds in gardens or on organic farms. How do you and how do the indigenous groups that you've worked with view this? Is it seen as just another sort of biopiracy or appropriation?
Yeah, that's a good question, you know, and I've struggled with it a little bit as well, but, you know, my attitude is that, you know, we're helping the seed survive, right? And we're helping the culture survive, you know, by planting the seed. And so the seeds that I grow were given to me by a Shawnee man, and I grow them in my backyard, and they're just weird and bizarre plants, and all my neighbors like freak out, you know, about 12-foot high corn and 25-pound cushaw. And, you know, it's just, so it's a lot of fun. And, you know, this spring I'm going to bring the dried corn that I grew to Oklahoma and have it prayed over. You know, I think most people are thrilled about it. But I do think, you know, your question about how to be an ally, right, is really tough. You know, and I think you will probably find some purists who say, don't plant our corn. They're out there for sure. But, you know, one of the things that I'm kind of hoping is that you all will be more discerning about the foods you eat. And when you go to buy, you know, wild rice, or, you know, just consider that there probably is an indigenous grower who wants to sell you that, right? And who wants you to eat it, right? And you'll really be doing a service, you know, to the community by buying it. And so it's kind of a mix. The other thing is just a commentary about the right of Native people to hunt and gather on their Aboriginal homeland. I think it's really important to remember that, you know, I use the term federally recognized tribe in the United States, and, you know, there are 567 of them in this country. And in the U.S. Constitution, there are 3 sovereigns, and Native tribes are one of those sovereigns. And so when we acknowledge Native treaty rights and their right to hunt and fish and gather on their former territory, we're acknowledging their sovereignty, you know, and we shouldn't protest their capacity to do what they have always done with the land, right? It was their right before we were even here. And it's their right encoded in the law.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we can take one last question. If anybody's got one more. Well, and if not, I want to thank you all for your engagement. This was a wonderful bunch of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you
and
very
thank you to
much.
Professor Warren for a
Thank
really
you.
interesting talk.
Thank you.